Systems Educator Training for Teachers and Early Childhood Educators, June 2020 virtual session. Setting the stage. A few points before we begin. Kindly complete the learning at your own pace. Jot down any questions in the BMS Q&A doc, see next slide. Review the slide content, including all videos. Complete and submit the learning quiz. No pressure. We sincerely endeavor to ensure the content of this session supports your learning needs. Q&A. You may be wondering, what if I have questions throughout this virtual training? Your questions are important to us. Please jot them down in the Google Doc that we created especially for you. Access the link here. Session intentions. By the end of the session, educators will know about the history of BMS, examine the ecological systems theory to understand student behavior, identify risk and protective factors, recognize key legislations and the implications of their practice, describe 4 phases of the BMS framework, review personal safety techniques, recognize conditions for containment, review reporting responsibilities, and know what resources are available to support BMS in their schools. Icebreaker. Please watch this video and consider what you observe.
This is a test of selective attention. Count how many times the players wearing white pass the basketball. How many passes did you count? Correct answer is 15 passes. But did you see the gorilla? This video is from research by Daniel Simons and Christopher Chabris and is copyrighted. It is available for use in talks.
Behavior Management System. Some background. BMS was established approximately 12 years ago. It takes into account provincial legislation that has a direct bearing on schools and how educators interact with students. It serves as a model. It was developed by educators for educators by the OESC. The OESC stands for Ontario Education Services Corporation, which is jointly owned by all school boards in Ontario. BMS is supported by the Ontario Ministry of Education. 85% of boards have shifted to BMS. BMS supports a tiered approach. The BMS philosophy is, kids do well if they can. Please follow the link below to the BMS website. BMS trains educators to safely deal with critical behavior incidents, imminent risk, in schools, and how to prevent and manage interfering behaviors on an ongoing daily basis. Behavior Management System continued. Integration of critical program components, including behavior assessments, IEPs, etc., is essential to the development of strategic behavior management plans. Behavior management is more effective when approached from a team perspective. Behavior stems primarily from needs and is strongly influenced by environmental and external factors and imminent risk. In addition to the consideration of environmental external factors, greatly enhances our understanding of the roots and triggers of behavior. Successful behavior management in schools is an ongoing process rather than just a response to critical incident. Imminent risk. What is imminent risk? BMS defines imminent risk as an action that presents immediate and impending threat to cause substantial physical injury, serious harm, to self or others. This may include the use of a weapon, risk of self-harm, elopement from school or property, such as onto a busy street, or significant property damage like breaking a window. This will be discussed in greater detail later in the presentation. BMS. Principals have been trained and are aware of the language and structure of BMS and are able to support all staff, EAs, CYWs, ECEs, and teachers in the application of BMS framework within their school community. As such, your principal is there to support you, teachers and ECEs, in your use of BMS theory and personal safety techniques, as well as to debrief following a critical incident. It should be noted that all NCDSB support staff have also been trained in BMS. Some key reflections of BMS. As a teacher or ECE, you will not be trained in the physical containment portion of BMS. However, it is anticipated that educators trained in the theory and personal safety will know the basic principles of BMS, participate in BMS training, appropriate level in relation to the educator's position, recognize extenuating factors and mitigate risk, take part in planning and debriefing following a critical incident. Remember that for many students, behavior as a skill has to be taught, as it is a learned outcome, just like any other subject. BMS certification. Levels of BMS certification. The NCDSB has chosen to take a tiered training approach to BMS. Teachers and ECEs will be trained in the theory and personal safety. At this time, there is no plan on training teachers or ECEs to do containment. For the purposes of today's training, we will review up to level 3, including containment. However, your involvement in containment will be from the perspective of an observer and a leader. The purpose of reviewing containment is to ensure that teachers and ECEs are aware of the processes and requirements related to containment. However, teachers and ECEs will not be certified in containment. Theory and personal safety. Warm-up. Please watch the video and note your observations.
To test just how much attention the attention-stealing design of the new Skoda Fabia actually steals, we left one parked on this ordinary road in West London. We wanted to see if its sharp crystalline shapes, bold lines, and lower, wider profile would attract the desired level of attention. Will the 17-inch black alloy wheels stop passers-by in their tracks? Will the angular headlights attract the attention of other road users? Will a crowd gather to check out its fresh, sporty look? Well, not quite. But did the attention-stealing design distract you from noticing that the entire street has been changing right before your very eyes? Believe us? Have another look. Did you spot the van changing to a taxi? How about the scooter changing to a pair of bicycles? Or the lady holding a pig? Let alone the fact that the entire street is now completely different. Didn't think so.
Observation is a skill that requires practice. It is a process. It is important to be aware of changes in our students, coworkers, and other adults, which may lead to a change in your perspective. Theories. BMS is founded on a few different theories, including psychosocial theory by Erik Erikson, social learning theory, and ecological systems theory. Although both psychosocial theory and social learning theory are important in relation to the development of BMS, we will focus today's learning on the theory most relevant to the classroom, ecological systems theory. However, we will note that the psychosocial theory was developed by Erik Erikson and identifies how personality arises from the way in which social conflict is resolved during various stages of development, highlighting 8 critical stages ranging from birth to late adulthood. In addition, social learning theory centers on the notion that thinking is part of learning. Individuals notice how others react to their behavior and respond accordingly. Finally, ecological systems theory helps educators to understand how a child's environment influences their development. This theory is comprised of 4 interconnected systems: the individual or microsystem, the secondary or mesosystem, the community or exosystem, and the social or macro system. Please stop the presentation and watch the following video.
One of the most exciting scientific findings of the past half-century has been the discovery of widespread trophic cascades. A trophic cascade is an ecological process which starts at the top of the food chain and tumbles all the way down to the bottom. And the classic example is what happened in the Yellowstone National Park in the United States when wolves were reintroduced in 1995. Now, we all know that wolves kill various species of animals, but perhaps we're slightly less aware that they give life to many others. Before the wolves turned up, they'd been absent for 70 years, but the numbers of deer, because there was nothing to hunt, had built up and built up in the Yellowstone Park, and despite efforts by humans to control them, they'd managed to reduce much of the vegetation there to almost nothing. They just grazed it away. But as soon as the wolves arrived, even though they were few in number, they started to have the most remarkable effects. First, of course, they killed some of the deer, but that wasn't the major thing. Much more significantly, they radically changed the behavior of the deer. The deer started avoiding certain parts of the park, the places where they could be tracked most easily, particularly the valleys and the gorges. And immediately those places started to regenerate. In some areas, the height of the trees quintupled in just 6 years. Bare valley sides quickly became forests of aspen and willow and cottonwood. As soon as that happened, the birds started moving in. The number of songbirds and migratory birds started to increase greatly. The number of beavers started to increase because beavers like to eat the trees. And beavers, like wolves, are ecosystem engineers. They create niches for other species. And the dams they built in the rivers provided habitats for otters and muskrats and ducks and fish and reptiles and amphibians. The wolves killed coyotes. And as a result of that, the number of rabbits and mice began to rise, which meant more hawks, more weasels, more foxes, more badgers. Ravens and bald eagles came down to feed on the carrion that the wolves had left. Bears fed on it too, and their population began to rise as well, partly also because there were more berries growing on the regenerating shrubs. And the bears reinforced the impact of the wolves by killing some of the calves of the deer. Here's where it gets really interesting. The wolves changed the behavior of the rivers. They began to meander less. There was less erosion. The channels narrowed. More pools formed. More riffle sections, all of which were great for wildlife habitats. The rivers changed in response to the wolves. And the reason was that the regenerating forests stabilized the banks so that they collapsed less often, so that the rivers became more fixed in their course. Similarly, by driving the deer out of some places and the vegetation recovering on the valley sides, there was less soil erosion because the vegetation stabilized that as well. So the wolves, small in number, transformed not just the ecosystem of the Yellowstone National Park, this huge area of land, but also its physical geography.
After watching this video, consider the following question. Consider how the concept relates to the classroom environment. If you change one piece of the environment, you can have profound change on the rest of the environment. After watching the video, consider how the concept relates to your classroom. A healthy ecosystem helps things grow and thrive. What can we change or do in the environment to help the student? It is important for teachers and ECEs to consider all of the factors which impact a student's perception of a situation and subsequent ability to learn. Ecological systems theory. As previously mentioned, the ecological systems theory helps educators to understand how a child's environment influences their development. Teachers and ECEs can reflect on the 4 levels of the system when faced with interfering behaviors. It should be noted that when we are not asking you to know all the factors impacting each student in your classroom, but rather are asking you to be curious when observing interfering behaviors. Prior to engaging with the student, take a moment to consider the factors which may be influencing the expression of interfering behavior, not only in the moment, but on a larger scale. Consider how each of the 4 systems may interact in relation to the incident at hand. Individual systems, micro. The individual system makes up the first level of the student's environment. Ecological systems theorists call this the microsystem. BMS has named this the individual system to help participants recognize that this system is being explored from an educational perspective on the individual personal level of the student. The individual system is the activities, roles, and interconnections between a student and his immediate environment. Ask yourself, can you think of examples of individual systems within an education environment? We considered the following: teacher-student relations, CYW student relations, EA student relations, lunchroom monitor student relations, peer-student relations. The secondary system, meso. The secondary system makes up the second level of the student's environment. Ecological systems theorists call this the mesosystem. BMS has named this the secondary system to help participants recognize that this system is being explored from an educational perspective. The secondary system is best described as the interaction between 2 or more individual systems. It is the relationship between 2 systems that we are focusing on in this level, not the activities, roles, and interactions described in the individual system. Ask yourself, can you think of examples of secondary systems within an educational environment? We considered the following: parent-teacher connections. A student's progress at school may be affected by the communication between the parent and the teacher. Teacher-teacher. A student's progress may be affected by the communication between 2 teachers. Principal-parent. Parent-community resource person. Educational assistant, teacher. Community system, EXO. The community system makes up the 3rd level of the student's environment. Ecological systems theorists call this the EXO system. BMS has named this the community system to help participants recognize that this system is being explored from an educational perspective. The community system refers to any social setting outside of the student's immediate experience that still affects them. Ask yourself, can anyone think of community system examples that may affect our students? We considered the following: community centers, parents' workplace, Children's Aid Society, community activities or programming, other service agencies, including the public health unit and early years programs. Social system, macro. The social system makes up the 4th level of the student's environment. Ecological systems theorists call this the macro system. BMS has named this the social system to help participants recognize that this system is being explored from an educational perspective. The social system refers to the values, customs, and laws within a culture or subculture that affect the student. Ask yourself, can you think of social systems examples that may affect students within an educational environment? We considered school environment culture, norms, values, and rules, teacher values, bias or their own family culture, current political structures and policies, family values, religion, how society views the neighborhood, gangs, social economic status, affluence, etc. Risk and protective factors. In conjunction with the aforementioned theories, BMS considers risk and protective factors. Risk and protective factors. BMS is centered on the notion that in an effort to support students' needs, it is necessary for educators to consider all of the factors that influence the student's performance. One way to support students is by considering the risk and protective factors associated with all aspects of the student's environment. BMS defines risk factors as any factor that increases the probability of the occurrence of a problem, including inconsistencies in aspects of daily life. Put simply, disadvantages. These are not judgments, but rather factors that might influence the occurrence of interfering behaviors. These risk factors can help explain the behavior, not excuse the behavior. However, you may address the situation differently depending on the student's circumstances. For teachers and ECEs, it is important to understand the impact that disability, trauma, mental health issues, family issues, etc. has on the student. BMS defines protective factors as any factor that assists students with becoming resilient and overcoming risk. Teachers and ECEs can themselves become a student's biggest protective factor, taking on the role of a reliable, caring adult within the classroom and school environment. Students may access other school resources that may serve as protective factors, such as accessing the breakfast program, mental health nurse, etc. Risk and protective factors are key elements of BMS. One of the biggest relationships related to mitigating risk and promoting protective factors is the relationship between the school staff, especially teachers and ECEs, and the community, as school culture can make a big difference, where open communication among staff and students will foster relationships and become a protective factor for many students and their families. Case study activity. Please pause the presentation and access the case study located in the shared folder. Please read the attached case study. After reading the case study, please list the risk and protective factors for Curtis. Risk and protective factors. BMS notes that most behaviors stem from the interaction between a student and their environment, rather than from within the student. Their behavior is a consequence of the antecedent or environmental factors with which they are presented. It is not willful. Therefore, if a situation is escalating, all educators need to continuously reflect on their relation to the student. Teachers and ECEs may ask themselves, am I being the risk factor or protective factor right now? They may wish to take a step back and observe, gather information, plan, and/or recruit assistance before acting. If you perceive yourself to be a risk factor, remove yourself. If that is not an option due to imminent risk of harm, remove the engagement. Do not add verbal directions or enter into discussions. It is not a learning situation for the student at this moment. Access a replacement person by utilizing a team approach. Find a protective person. Plan ahead, know your student. Be aware. Who has the best rapport? Are you a risk factor? Readjust, evaluate, gather information. Legislation. BMS is grounded on 6 key areas of legislation: the Ontario Education Act and Regulations, the Ontario Human Rights Commission, the Occupational Health and Safety Act, the Child, Youth and Family Services Act, the Criminal Code of Canada, the Child Care and Early Years Act. It should be noted that containment of a student does not appear anywhere in the Ontario Education Act and Regulations. As such, in following best practice, we must look to the next closest piece of legislation pertaining to children, the Child and Youth Family Services Act. The Child Family Youth Services Act was originally established for children in residential treatment and states that physical restraint may only be used as a last resort, and that monitoring of the student for health and safety reasons, as well as monitoring of the staff, must occur during any containment by a free-standing observer. The Ontario Education Act. Key points of the Ontario Education Act and regulations include that it is the duty of the principal and teachers to maintain order, discipline, and safety, that staff must report any behaviors that could lead to suspension or expulsion to the principal as soon as possible, that staff must respond to any problem behavior, providing it is safe to do so, including imminent risk, that staff must take mitigating factors into consideration when responding to behavior and must consider factors that give a reason for behavior but do not excuse it, including, does the student have the ability to control his or her behavior? Does the student have the ability to understand the foreseeable consequences of the behavior? In relation to an IEP, was the behavior a manifestation of a disability identified in the student's IEP? Has appropriate individual accommodation been provided? Will the suspension expulsion likely result in aggravating or worsening of the student's behavior in the future? And that staff must use progressive discipline when responding to interfering behaviors. The Ontario Human Rights Code and Commission. Key points of the Ontario Human Rights Commission. The OHRC emphasizes that the importance of gathering complete information to determine if inappropriate behavior is related to mitigating and/or extenuating factors. The list of mitigating factors includes, but is not limited to, the following: the student's ability to control the behavior, the student's ability to understand the consequences of behavior, the nature of the student, their age, disabilities, victims of discrimination or harassment, the history of the student, any family trauma, dysfunction, intent, previous incidents, degree of harm. When planning for behavior management, the guidelines for progressive discipline, where appropriate, must be incorporated. These factors include exceptionalities and diagnoses, must be taken into consideration in developing appropriate plans for the management of behavior. The Occupational Health and Safety Act. Key points of the Occupational Health and Safety Act. The OHSA deems that reasonable precautions for working with students who have significant behavior issues include not only training in recognizing and handling behaviors, but preparation of appropriate program plans, IEPs, and safety plans, which must be on file in the student's OSR, as well as available to staff with whom the student works. Appropriate programming involves knowledge of the student's behavior history and knowledge of factors that would be relevant in appropriate program planning. When considering the use of a containment, reflect on some key factors, including: is the educator certified in this approach? Appropriate training involves knowing how to properly and safely execute student containment. This includes knowing when to release a containment, i.e., risk of injury to educator. The Child and Youth Family Services Act. Key points of the Child and Youth Family Services Act. Physical restraint may only be carried out if there is a clear and imminent risk that the student will physically injure himself and/or others. Physical restraint may never be used as a punishment. Physical restraint may only be used if less intrusive techniques are or would be ineffective. As such, physical restraint is considered to be a last resort. When physical restraint of a student is carried out, it must be carried out using the least amount of force that is necessary. During physical restraint of a student, the student's condition must be continually monitored and assessed. The role of an observer, principal or teacher or ECE, is to not only monitor for physical positions, but to also monitor for the level of force required. Physical restraint of a student must be stopped upon either of the following, whichever comes first. When there is no longer a clear or imminent risk that the student will physically injure himself or herself or others, or when there is a risk that the physical restraint itself will endanger the health or safety of the student. Planned physical restraint may only be carried out by staff members who have received appropriate training, and only approved techniques may be used. The use of planned physical restraint must be part of an approved plan, an IEP or safety plan for a student. Debriefing of staff and students where appropriate must follow the use of physical restraint within 24 hours and a second debrief within 48. These debriefs are mandatory and must be documented. The Criminal Code of Canada. Key points for the Criminal Code of Canada. Those who use reasonable force to restrain or remove a child in appropriate circumstances are protected by law. Court may determine the reasonableness of the force used. While limited corporal punishment by parents is still allowed, such as spanking, the use of corporal punishment by teachers is not allowed. School staff may use reasonable force to restrain the student if injury to the student or others is imminent. This applies to whether the staff member is trained or untrained in containment. The important factor relates to whether the force used was reasonable and whether the intent of the restraint was to avoid harm or injury. Example, a 6-year-old child at your school is upset and starts to run towards a busy street. What are you allowed to do? Please see the example on this slide. The Child Care and Early Years Act. Key points of the Child Care and Early Years Act. The CCEYA also speaks to the use of force or the use of restraint with children. The Act states that where a child is receiving child care at a center premises, where the provision of child care is overseen, prohibited practices include corporal punishment of the child is strictly prohibited under any circumstances. Other prohibited practices include the physical restraint of a child, such as confinement of the child to a high chair, car seat, stroller, or other device for the purposes of discipline or in lieu of supervision, unless the physical restraint is for the purpose of preventing a child from hurting himself, herself, or someone else, only until the risk of injury is no longer imminent. Locking the exits of a child care center or child care premises for the purposes of confining the child or confining the child to an area or room within the building without adult supervision, unless such confinement occurs during an emergency and is required as part of the emergency management policies and procedures. The use of harsh or degrading measures or threats, or use of derogatory language directed at or used in the presence of a child that would humiliate, shame, or frighten the child or undermine his or her self-respect, dignity, or self-worth is prohibited. Depriving the child of basic needs including food, drink, shelter, sleep, toilet use, clothing, or bedding. Inflicting any bodily harm on children, including making children eat or drink against their will. Teachers and ECEs should take note that this also relates to choosing what snack to eat. Students have the right to eat or drink whatever is brought from home. Teachers and ECEs may only make suggestions about choosing a snack, but cannot remove food or drink items or prevent a student from accessing what is in their possession, which was provided from home.
1. Is there a different way at looking at the situation? It is important to look at a challenging behavior from other perspectives. Be curious about the student and their behavior. What is driving it? BMS has a framework to assist us in understanding the elements that contribute to successful behavior management. There are 4 quadrants in the BMS framework. Each quadrant is equally important in establishing successful strategies for behavior management. We must ensure that the student is in the center of the exploration for each of the quadrants. This is a fluid model, and it does not need to start in any one quadrant. However, with our more challenging students, it is likely to start in the information gathering phase. Information gathering phase. Observe the student and be curious about the behavior. Investigate the triggers. Find out the risk and protective factors. Be objective. Be careful, as you may do this in a judgmental way and make assumptions. May also access reports, IEPs, etc. Action phase. This is how we respond to an escalating student. It involves managing the day-to-day behavior, student emergencies, personal crises that have become emergencies, school emergencies like 911 calls, imminent risk and serious risk of injury that requires 911. Our body language, nonverbal, is extremely important. 85 to 90% of what we communicate is through body language and facial expressions. Look at your body language from the student's perspective. Try to be aware of stimulus or unknown triggers. As soon as you are in a power struggle with a student, get yourself out. Give power back to the student for the time being. Review and debrief phase. Review the incident and the team involved as an opportunity to learn and listen to others' perspectives and observations. Be supported and acknowledge conditions that may have led to the confrontation. Review and debrief the incident with the student to understand their perspective and rebuild the relationship. Planning phase. Plan for future incidents. This may be the time to establish safety plans and BSP if they are not already in place. This is a good time to have a school-based team meeting. Information gathering phase. It is during this phase that we want to ensure we have as much information as possible to help guide interventions. We gather information to help prevent problems, support students, guide interventions, and clarify. What can we do? We can read any existing documentation, previous BSPs, safety plans, OSR, IEP, IPRC, records, assessment, reports, psychoeds, but know your board protocols relating to confidentiality and access to personal information. Identify strategies and supports that have been useful in the past. Consult with family, other resources, observing and interviewing others, and documenting behavior. Refer to your tip sheets provided in the Access Drive. Action phase. In an emergency, there's often confusion and anxiety, both on the part of the students and staff. It is critical to have discussed a plan before an emergency occurs. If this is a school emergency, such as a lockdown, follow the school's safety plan. If this is a student in personal crisis, some guiding principles apply. Be calm, validate and offer support. Stay on topic, be accurate and realistic, convey hope, and provide realistic choices. Your goal is to help the student regain a sense of equilibrium. In an emergency, you must stay focused on the overall goal of returning the individual from a state of disequilibrium to a state of equilibrium. Your goal is to stay calm and focused on the objective. During the action phase, we can intervene non-verbally with our body language, our facial expressions. We can intervene verbally. We can intervene physically only if there is imminent risk to the student. And we can use a combination of several interventions. Consider these interventions from the student's perspective. Think about how each nonverbal, verbal, and physical intervention will have an effect on the relationship between you and the student. Any intervention will evoke a reaction, and remember that physical invites physical. Nonverbal, verbal, physical interventions will either diffuse or drive a behavior. Think about how your reaction will change the situation, for better or for worse. And always imagine that the student's parents are right behind you. Ask yourself, would you engage in that response language intervention if the parents were watching? We communicate more non-verbally than verbally. Many students are quite keen to pick up on even minor cues or have their own perspective. The way we stand, the placement of our arms, the look on our face. Our goal is to present as a caring adult. We need to be mindful of what we are communicating from the student's perspective. We most often are unable to control sensory factors in the school or classroom, but we can control our body language and facial expressions. Be cautious of reality versus perception reality. Students don't lie about how someone makes them feel. Often they assume that they are not liked by educators. This is their perception, but what is driving this perception? Look at what we can do differently to help the student shift their perspective. Be aware of how you are presenting to the student. We want to model a calm, composed, caring adult. What do students learn from physical intimidation from adults? They learn that this is socially acceptable, that it works, and therefore also use this as a measure to get what they want. Our verbal interventions, our words, tone of voice, can work towards calming the student. The goal is to return the student to a state of equilibrium. Setting limits is a difficult skill to acquire, and it does take practice. There is an art of setting limits, and it is the key to everything. How we ask and what we are asking must be considered. For example, deliver the instruction, then leave and remove yourself, but make sure you are being reasonable in what you are asking. Or if a time limit is given to clean up, but an educator remains beside the student, they then become the target. We get into false promises or something unreasonable to the infraction. We end up negotiating or bribing students. Make sure the limits are firm and clear. For example, stop pushing, please. Or sit quietly at your desk with your math workbook on your desk. If you don't know what to say, don't say anything at all, especially if the student is becoming irrational. Venting. Allow students to vent, and do not take this personally.
The third and final component of the action phase is the physical component, which is comprised into 3 separate categories. The 3 categories include a safe, supportive stance, personal safety techniques, and containment. The physical component section primarily focuses on the purpose of information sharing with our teacher and ECE participants until additional face-to-face practical training can be delivered during the following academic school year. The practical training will encompass components of the safe supportive stance and the personal safety techniques only. This level of training will ensure that educators are familiar with the process of how to remain at a safe distance, how to protect vital organs, and how to avoid significant injury should they encounter a confrontational or aggressive incident with a student. One key point to remember about utilizing any of the physical components is that physical invites physical. This means that should a student be at the receiving end of an educator who utilizes ongoing physical interventions, that this may result in a heightened state of escalation from the student. For this reason, we encourage utilizing a variety of access to nonverbal and verbal components as well throughout the intervention. It is crucial for an educator to remember to use the least intrusive intervention where possible, depending on what the incident entails. That being said, you will note from the presentation slide that NCDSB teachers and ECEs will receive the Theory and Personal Safety Techniques certification, but will not participate in the containment certification. Despite this, it is beneficial for all educators to have some exposure to minimal knowledge about containment interventions for the purpose of enhancing familiarity and creating a shared language of BMS terminology, ensuring the safety by providing observation and or support to either the student and or support staff that are directly involved in the containment. And lastly, understanding the containment principles, protocols, legislation, and any other pertinent information as it relates to containments. The next 9 slides are available for you to observe and gather information. Please feel free to browse through the slides and ask any questions you may have on the document. The link to this document is provided to you on slide 3. Prior to your self-directed exploration of each of the 3 physical components, here is an enlightening and humorous video demonstrating personal space.
So, Elaine, you don't have a problem with her, do you?
We adore Elaine.
She wants to say hi. She's with her new boyfriend.
What's he like?
He's nice, bit of a close talker.
A what?
You'll see.
This is Erin. Hello, Erin.
Hello, so how long are you folks in town?
We're going with a select charter group.
I love France. I was just there last year. In fact, you know, I still have an envelope full of French francs. I'll give them to you.
We can't take money.
No, it's a gift from us.
Oh, that is so nice, Erin. Isn't he nice? So listen, is Jared showing you a good time?
No, I haven't.
You know,
Action phase, safe supportive stance. Please click on the link to observe the components and demonstration of a safe supportive stance. Action phase, personal safety. Personal safety techniques continued. Please click on the links to observe the components and demonstration of the personal safety techniques. Personal safety tips to consider. Are you mitigating risks? Consider the working environment and prepare accordingly. For example, if working in an isolated area, ensure that another educator is aware of your location. Be in eyesight or earshot of another staff so that assistance can be provided immediately. Know your school protocol for getting assistance when needed, and continue with BMS interventions. If de-escalating interventions such as nonverbal, verbal, and personal safety techniques have not been effected and/or where imminent risk remains present, containment certified educators must consider these factors. Number 1, it requires a team approach. Number 2, the level of immediate or imminent risk. Number 3, the history of the student, considering previous trauma, medical considerations, and repeated containments. Number 4, the relationship to the student. Number 5, the physical characteristics of the student. So for example, their size, any health factors, or risk of positional asphyxiation. And lastly, number 6, they must consider the physical environment. A decision may be made to implement a containment if the student's behavior is posing a serious risk, such as attempting to assault another person, attempting self-injury, attempting to leave a supervised area and his or her personal safety is at imminent risk, and lastly, attempting to damage property, which may result in injury to self or others. A quick pause to clarify. Who does containment? Only those educators trained and certified in theory and personal safety and containment are certified to do containments. But educators certified in any level of BMS training apply BMS principles appropriate to their level of training in their interactions with students. Action phase, physical component. Please click on the links to observe the components and demonstration of a small person containment and a large person containment. Let's recap. In respect to BMS, when intervening, questions to consider. What is the behavior telling me? What is the intent of the intervention? What systems do I have in place? Who are the team members? What am I expecting? Are there safety concerns and practices? Would I intervene the same if a parent were watching? If no, what would I change? Key considerations after an incident. Please take a moment to read through these considerations. If the incident reveals a pattern of risks or harm to self or others, it is time to create a BSP or a safety plan. Consider creating a safety plan with the help of a member of the BST team. In the event of a containment, a debrief must occur. The initial debrief occurs following the incident once safety of all is assured, within 24 hours. It may not be possible to have a debrief during the school day. However, educators should consult with their school principal to establish a debrief within the appropriate timeline required. A secondary debrief should happen within 2 business days. The principal must keep a written record of the debrief meeting, and it is good practice to keep a journal of the incident and the debriefing in a numbered journal. The goal of the day of debrief is to assess injuries, reassess and follow up with a student, review communication protocol, who does what, and an immediate staff debriefing, so a team discussion, express feelings and opinions, review what happened, modified strategies, and a planning review. The goal of the secondary debrief is to prevent a similar situation from happening again in the future, to provide necessary paperwork to support the needs of the student, and finally to ensure a team is available to provide supports for the student. Following an incident, the Ministry of Labor could look for proof of training and that the debriefing phase was completed. That being said, following a containment, our debrief needs to involve, number 1, an injury assessment to ensure that everyone is okay and getting immediate assistance if necessary. Number 2, reassure and follow up with the student is an opportunity to reestablish communication after the tension has reduced, to regain control of yourself, and to help the student regain emotional control of themselves. Number 3, determining the protocol for communicating with those involved or impacted. So who does what? And this is in respect to the office, who contacts the parents, who contacts 911, etc. You never want a student to go home where there's a physical containment where the parent is not aware of it. Number 4, there are 2 types of educator debriefing. The first one is ongoing debriefing for educators who deal with behavior incidents on an ongoing basis. For example, staff in high-risk special education classes. And the second type of debriefing is imminent incident debriefing where a containment was required. Please note, immediate staff debriefing must follow the requirements outlined previously. Number 5 is documentation. In hectic schedules or in the aftermath of an imminent incident, documentation is often overlooked or left too long before completion and the details become clouded. The Ministry of Education and the Ministry of Labor require certain specific documentation. Individual school boards may have additional requirements, and some documentation will be developed locally to assist in programming. Please refer to the safety plan template. Number 6, follow-up staff debriefing as noted on the previous slide. The purpose of this is to not find fault and to have people document what happened from their perspective. Lastly is ongoing staff support. Within this domain, you want to make sure you reestablish relationships and reestablish a reentry plan, and also that restorative practices are done as needed. The planning phase can be a useful component for either academics or behavior management. During this phase, educators need to consider both long and short-term goals. The planning phase typically occurs when there is a new student who has been identified either formally or informally as requiring specialized behavior support, or after an incident where the SB school-based team feels that more planning is required to either prevent or prepare for future incidents. Some planning considerations include having an understanding of the phase by knowing who is on the school-based team and having a clear indication of what services are available within the school community and the board. The planning phase requires compiling and gathering information and then using the information gathered to formulate plans that will be implemented in order to achieve certain tasks identified. The planning phase also clarifies roles and responsibilities of identified educators involved in the plan, as well as will promote teamwork and accountability. Some guiding questions that you may find helpful are, do I have the tools necessary to support this student? If this student has an exceptionality, specific diagnosis, or special circumstance, do I understand this enough to support them in my classroom? If not, what resources and or support are available through either the board or within our community? Have I reached out and contacted the guardians and welcomed their participation and assistance? Is additional consultation or testing required? And lastly, would community supports benefit this student and his or her family? Educators are encouraged to access the expertise within their own classroom, school community, and board resources. Some types of helpful strategies available may include writing or modifying an IEP, developing or modifying the BSP and safety plans, and within this, the BSP and safety plans should be placed in an accessible area for staff, such as in a binder at the front office, to ensure confidentiality. It is also important to note that BSP should also be reviewed and signed off by the respective team members who are involved with the student. Some other helpful strategies include reviewing a functional behavior assessment, changing the location of a student's desk, altering the physical layout of the classroom, contacting outside support agencies with appropriate consent, setting up a parent meeting or a case conference, conducting a safety audit, implementing a behavior log, and lastly, altering or modifying academic content to meet the student's needs or interests. The purpose of a safety plan are to monitor the student consistently for the purpose of health and safety, to monitor educators for the purpose of litigation, as all educators need to be aware that we all have a duty to respond in the best way we can in order to prevent any detrimental effects or harm to the student. The purpose is also to provide consistency in educators' approaches when the interfering behavior is not a one-time occurrence, but rather reoccurring. It also helps establish the process for autism and behavior support services. And lastly, articulates a process for containment and or for phasing out the containment intervention. Some safety plan considerations include, when creating plans to incorporate a school-based team approach where a contribution of ideas, feedback, and perspectives are shared and welcomed by all educators who work directly with the student. Although time constraints and scheduling issues are often factors in preventing a collaborative approach, an option to help alleviate these factors may be to request approval to schedule meetings before and after school from your designated superintendent. Also, the legal guardian of a student does not need to sign off on the safety plan. The safety plan was created based on legislation, and educators within the school community do have a duty to respond to any imminent risk. However, it is important to note that requesting guardian input may not always be easy. A possible suggestion would be to stamp the safety plan as a draft on the document so guardians know they can give input. It is also important to consider that the guardians generally want to do what is best for their child and often have valuable information that may not be known to educators. Next, if physical containment interventions are indicated on a safety plan, educators must remember that the containment is done as a last resort. In addition, there must be a clear and imminent risk of harm present to either the student and/or others, rather than the interventions not being successful. Always attempt alternative interventions and remember that even if you can do a containment, this doesn't always mean that you should. Consider and remind yourself frequently about the containment protocol. Are containment interventions a prescribed part of a safety plan? If they are a prescribed part of a safety plan, they can be done in conjunction with the Autism and Behavior Support team members or the BMS trainers. If additional BMS support is required, the containment intervention videos are available online from the BMS website or in this presentation. Lastly, all safety plans must be stored in a documentation file in the OSR and must be shared with any educator who works directly with the student. This is including but not limited to supply teachers and/or supply support staff, lunch monitors, etc. Criteria for a safety plan includes when a student's interfering behavior results in an imminent risk for safety to self or others. So an example of this would be physical aggression with or without objects, self-injurious behavior, or elopement, and is a second occurrence of a similar behavior. Please note, a safety plan may exist independent from a behavior support plan under certain conditions. For example, if a parent requests that this is done, or if significant incident happens that precipitated a need for a safety plan. If, however, any of the following increases, the frequency, severity, intensity, and/or duration of the interfering behavior, then a BSP must also be put into place to support the student. Why? The safety plan provides a short-term management. It's like treating the symptoms, not the underlying cause. Where a safety plan with accompanying BSPs are needed, access to the behavior support team services via referral to the board. The first step is to complete a referral. Please note that the referral to the Autism and Behavior Support team can be fast-tracked. The plan will be developed from observations, data collection, and in conjunction with the school team. The plans are reviewed with the team supervisor and with a BCBA consultant. BST staff will communicate and follow up with the school within a timely manner. Another useful tool is a classroom safety audit form, which can be used in conjunction with the safety plan. The purpose of this tool is to audit areas where students are likely to go during an escalation. A sample copy of an audit form is located in the shared folder. Some other considerations include who are the team members, what is expected, what are some safe places to go with students, what areas should be avoided, and lastly, how do we summon assistance if needed? Planning phase. One last point about safety plans. Where criteria B on the previous slide indicates a serious behavior of concern resulting in imminent risk is present, please note that a safety plan is regarded as a short-term intervention, may exist independently of a BSP under certain circumstances, specifies educators' actions in a crisis, whereas the BSP is an everyday approach to enhancing positive skills and positive behavior. And lastly, is completed in collaboration with a member of the Autism and Behavior Support team via referral to the board. Planning phase, more than just for crisis situations. This can also be used as a tool for school teams. The BMS framework, the 4 phases, can be used as a supportive model to guide school teams by providing an opportunity for discussion for complex student cases, guiding communication with all staff regarding how to engage should there be an incident, identifying gaps or strengths in school processes, and creating a common language for supporting students. Thank you for your time and participation in this training, as it is truly appreciated. Please follow the remaining steps outlined in the eHub course.
I think